The old couple walked slowly toward the restaurant, hand in hand, dressed in their best clothes. Mr. Jensen wore a suit he had owned for over 20 years, and Mrs. Jensen had put on a light pink dress that once turned heads in her youth. They were both smiling softly, excited for their special evening. Today was their 50th wedding anniversary, and they had picked this expensive restaurant after saving for months. It wasn't just about the food, it was about the memory they wanted to create. As they stepped inside, the lights were bright and soft music played in the background. The place was full of young people, laughing, taking photos, and dressed in stylish modern clothes. The hostess at the front desk glanced at them and raised an eyebrow. She didn't say anything rude, but her smirk said enough. Still, she walked them to a table in the far corner, next to the restrooms and away from the garden view. Mr. Jensen noticed it, but said nothing. He pulled out the chair for his wife, who smiled and sat gently. "It's perfect," she whispered, placing her old handbag on her lap. She didn't care about the table location. She was just happy to be out with the man she had loved for 50 years. Nearby, a group of young men and women in designer clothes looked over at them. One of them laughed quietly, and another said something under his breath. Their table burst into giggles, but the couple didn't notice or pretended not to. The waitress came by, her voice bored, and handed them the menu without eye contact. When Mr. Jensen mentioned their anniversary, she simply said, "Okay," and walked away. Mrs. Jensen looked around the room, admiring the chandeliers and soft candlelight. She gently touched the old locket around her neck, a gift from her husband decades ago. "Do you remember when we danced under the stars in Italy?" she asked, her eyes full of light. Mr. Jensen chuckled. "You made that night shine more than the stars." They laughed softly, lost in their own world, but others kept looking at them. The young group next to them whispered more jokes, one of them mocking Mr. Jensen's worn-out shoes. They took a selfie, and in the background, the old couple could be seen. One girl added a sarcastic caption and showed it to the group. They all laughed again, louder this time. The couple paused, glanced over, but said nothing. Time passed, and their food didn't come. Other tables, who came later, were already eating. Mrs. Jensen whispered, "Maybe they forgot about us." Mr. Jensen raised his hand politely to get the waiter's attention. The waiter came over with a blank face and said, "It's coming." Before walking away, the old couple continued to smile. They held hands and talked about their wedding day, the small cake they had shared, the dance in the rain. They didn't need expensive food or attention. They had each other. But even then, a small sadness hid behind their smiles. They had come hoping for a warm experience, a kind moment in a cold world. From the kitchen doorway, the head chef briefly stepped out and scanned the restaurant. He noticed the old couple in the corner. He noticed the table of young guests nearby laughing and whispering. He didn't yet know the full story, but something didn't feel right. He walked back into the kitchen, his mind wondering what was really happening at that table. As Mr. Jensen looked at his watch, he leaned toward his wife. "Do you want to go somewhere else?" he asked gently. She shook her head. "No, I want to be here with you." Even though the air around them felt colder, they held on to their warmth. Outside the restaurant, the night was peaceful, but inside, kindness was missing. The old couple didn't want to be treated like royalty. They just wanted to feel welcome, to be seen. But in that fancy restaurant, among shiny plates and beautiful faces, they were invisible, and the night had only just begun. What they didn't know was that one person had seen everything, and he would not forget it. Something was about to change, but it hadn't happened yet. For now they waited, quietly, hopefully, still holding hands, still smiling, still believing that maybe, just maybe, the night could turn around. But the whispers kept coming, and the cold food hadn't even arrived. Their special night was becoming something else, a test of patience, of grace, of whether love could still shine in a place where respect had vanished. They didn't know someone in the kitchen had noticed, and that would soon matter more than they could imagine. The loud laughter from the table nearby grew stronger. The group of young people, dressed in fancy clothes and full of energy, didn't care who heard them. One of the men leaned closer to his friends and pointed at Mr. Jensen's old jacket. "It looks like he borrowed that from a museum," he joked. Everyone at the table burst into laughter. The waitress walking by glanced at them and smiled instead of stopping the rude behavior. She even giggled quietly. When one girl added, "Maybe they're just lost and ended up in the wrong place." Mr. Jensen heard it, but he pretended not to. He took a sip of his water and gave his wife a gentle smile. Mrs. Jensen was quieter now, looking down at the menu even though she had already decided what to order. Her fingers touched the edge of the table, slowly tracing it as if to calm herself. She had heard the laughter too, but she didn't want to ruin their evening by saying anything. She just wanted to enjoy her husband's company, even if everything else felt wrong. When the waitress finally returned to take their order, she spoke in a rushed tone. She didn't ask if they had any questions or suggestions. She barely looked at them and sighed when Jensen politely asked what the chef's special included. "It's on the menu," she said shortly, and waited with her pen in hand. Mr. Jensen ordered steak, and his wife chose the vegetable risotto. "Anything else?" the waitress asked, already turning away. "It's our anniversary tonight," Mr. Jensen said with a soft smile, hoping it would mean something. The waitress paused for half a second, then said, "Okay," and left. There was no congratulations, no warm words, no candles, no little cake, nothing special. Just silence from the staff and whispers from the people around them. The young group next to them started another round of drinks. One of the women raised her glass and said loudly, "To love and not becoming like that when we're old." Everyone laughed again. A man added, "If I ever look like that at a restaurant, just shoot me." Mrs. Jensen flinched this time, her hand moving to her lap, holding the small old purse she had carried since the 1980s. She didn't look up, but her eyes became glassy. Still, she forced a small smile and whispered, "Ignore them, Harold." Mr. Jensen gave her hand a soft squeeze under the table. "I am," he said, though his chest felt tight. Their water glasses stayed nearly empty. Other tables had waiters pouring fresh water and serving wine, but not theirs. One couple near the window had just arrived, and their appetizer was already on the table, steaming hot. Mr. Jensen checked his watch again. They had been waiting over 30 minutes, still no food, no bread, not even a napkin refill. He raised his hand again, trying to catch someone's attention. A different waiter walked by and quickly turned his head. Pretending not to see, Mr. Jensen lowered his hand slowly and sighed. "They must be very busy tonight," he said kindly, still trying to stay hopeful. Mrs. Jensen nodded, but her silence said she knew better. Suddenly, one of the young men at the loud table stood up and took a selfie with his friends. He aimed his camera so that Mr. and Mrs. Jensen were visible in the background. He added a sticker to the photo, "Date Night Goals," and showed it to his group. They laughed again and whispered comments that weren't even quiet anymore. The laughter echoed through the restaurant like sharp knives. Still, no staff member stepped in to stop it. Not the hostess, not the waitress, not the manager, if there even was one present. In the kitchen, Chef Marco was plating a dish when one of the junior chefs made a joke. Some grandpa in the corner ordered the special. "Think he'll survive the spice?" Marco looked up confused. "Who?" he asked. "The old guy in the corner," the young chef replied, chuckling. "They're like the forgotten table." Marco didn't laugh. Something about that phrase made him pause. The forgotten table, he whispered to himself. Back at the table, Mrs. Jensen was now staring at her empty plate. She wasn't hungry anymore. She just wanted to leave. But she didn't want to break her husband's heart. He had worked hard to make this evening possible, and she didn't want to ruin it for him. She looked up and forced another smile. "I'm sure the food will come soon," she said softly. Mr. Jensen nodded. He believed it too, but mostly because he wanted to believe it. From across the room, Chef Marco stepped out quietly and looked toward the corner table. He saw the couple sitting still, hands folded, no food, no service. And then he looked at the laughing group next to them. They were drinking, celebrating, loud and full of jokes. Something wasn't right. He had been too busy in the kitchen, but now his eyes were open. He turned and walked back into the kitchen without saying a word. But in his heart, something had shifted. The couple had come in peace, in love, with decades of memories, and somehow, in this expensive place full of gold lights and fine plates, they had been treated like shadows. What they didn't know was that someone had finally noticed, and that person wasn't just anyone. He was the man who controlled the heart of the restaurant, the chef himself, and soon, the silence around their table would no longer be ignored. More than an hour had passed, and still, no food had arrived at the elderly couple's table. Mr. Jensen looked at his wife and smiled softly, trying to stay calm, but inside, he was growing worried and sad. He didn't want this evening to turn into a disappointment. Not after all the effort they had made just to be there. They had waited patiently, hoping each time someone walked by that their food would come. But every time, the plates went to other tables. Tables where the guests had come later than them. Tables full of younger, richer-looking people. Mrs. Jensen shifted in her seat. Her back was hurting now, but she didn't want to complain. She looked around and saw a waitress laughing with a nearby group. She wasn't laughing when she came to their table earlier. In fact, she barely spoke at all. Mr. Jensen gently waved at a passing waiter and asked kindly, "Excuse me, sir, do you know when our meal will be ready?" The waiter didn't even stop walking. He said, "Let me check," and disappeared into the kitchen. But he never came back. Meanwhile, the group next to them received another round of drinks and a plate of desserts. On the house, the waiter had said. They cheered, laughed, and began making fun of the chocolate decorations. One woman said loudly, "Now this is how a real date night should be." Then she looked over at the Jensens and smirked. "They look like they ordered food in a different century," someone added. The group laughed again, louder than before. Mrs. Jensen placed her hands on her lap and looked down. She didn't want to cry. She had told herself she wouldn't cry tonight, but her eyes were burning and her throat felt tight. Still, she stayed silent and strong. She didn't want to make her husband feel worse. Mr. Jensen noticed her silence. He reached across the table and touched her hand gently. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "It's not your fault," she whispered back. "I just thought we could make a new memory here tonight," he said with a broken smile. "We already are," she replied, squeezing his hand. "But it's not the one we hoped for." In the kitchen, Chef Marco was plating dishes quickly. He was a busy man, focused on making sure every plate looked perfect. But something had been bothering him since he saw the couple in the corner. He paused and asked the staff, "Where's the steak and risotto order for table 12? One of the kitchen staff looked around and shrugged. "I think it was sent out." "Was it correct?" Marco asked. Another cook answered. "Didn't matter, it was just the old couple." Marco froze. "What do you mean, just the old couple?" Younger sous chef laughed. "Come on, they're probably not big tippers. And they look like they're from a nursing home." Chef Marco stared at him, his face turning serious. "They've been waiting over an hour," he said slowly. The room got quiet. Marco put down his tools and walked out of the kitchen again. Back in the dining area, the waiter finally returned to the Jensen's table holding 2 plates. He placed them down without saying a word. The steak was overcooked, and the risotto looked dry. Mr. Jensen politely asked, "Sorry, but I think this is not what we ordered." The waiter rolled his eyes. "That's what the kitchen gave me," and walked away. Mrs. Jensen poked her fork into the risotto and forced a smile. "It's fine, we can eat this." But it wasn't fine, and they both knew it. The steak was tough and cold. Still, Mr. Jensen cut a small piece and tried to chew. He couldn't. He put the fork down and looked at his wife. "I think we should just go," he said softly. She nodded, but didn't move. It was hard to walk away from something they had waited for with so much hope. Chef Marco watched them from behind a pillar. He saw the old man place his napkin on the table and help his wife to her feet. They were leaving, and they hadn't even taken 2 full bites. Something inside Marco twisted. He couldn't let it end like this. He walked quickly toward the front, passing the laughing group and ignoring their loud noise. Just as the couple reached the door, he stepped in front of them. "Sir, ma'am," he said gently. They stopped, surprised. "I'm the head chef," he said. "I just found out what happened, and I want to apologize personally." Mr. Jensen shook his head. "We appreciate it, but we don't want to cause trouble." "You're not causing trouble," Marco said. "The trouble is what we caused you." He looked at the cold plates still on their table, and then back at them. "I want to fix this," he said, but Mrs. Jensen smiled with kindness in her tired eyes. "We just wanted to feel welcome tonight," she said softly. Her voice trembled a little. "But I think we're just not meant to be here." Marco felt something heavy in his chest. He had seen hundreds of customers, many demanding, many rude, but this couple had been quiet, kind, and full of love, and yet they were the ones who had been ignored and mistreated. As they walked out the door slowly, holding hands once again, Marco stood still, watching them disappear into the night. It was too late to stop them, but maybe it wasn't too late to do something more. He turned back toward the kitchen, his face hard with a decision. This would never happen again, not in his restaurant. Not while he was in charge, and especially not to people like them, who had only come in search of one good memory, one peaceful night, one little moment of kindness. Now it was time to make it right. Even if the apology had already come too late, Chef Marco stood frozen near the door, watching the elderly couple leave. Their slow steps, their soft voices, and the way they held hands, it all hit him deeply. He had worked in kitchens for over 20 years. He had seen rude customers, fussy children, broken plates, and angry bosses, but tonight, something different happened. Tonight, something painful had taken place right under his nose. He looked around the dining hall. The group of young guests who had mocked the couple were still laughing. They were finishing their free desserts, their loud voices bouncing off the walls. They didn't care what they had done. They didn't care who they had hurt. Marco's jaw tightened as he turned and walked quickly back into the kitchen. The kitchen staff was still busy preparing meals. Loud sounds of pans, sizzling oil, and orders being shouted filled the air. Marco's voice cut through it like a knife. "Stop everything," he said firmly. The staff froze. "Where is the original order for table 12? He asked. A young chef mumbled, "We made changes, chef." They looked. "Not that important." Marco took a deep breath. "You mean they didn't look rich?" he said flatly. No one answered. Another chef added quietly, "We didn't think they'd complain, chef." Marco's eyes burned, not with anger but with guilt. "They didn't complain because they had manners," he said. "Because they had more respect than any of us showed them." He walked to the corner of the kitchen and opened the reservation log. There it was, in clean handwriting. "Mr. and Mrs. Jensen, 50th wedding anniversary. Please arrange a special candle." At the table, Marco closed the book and leaned on the counter. No candle, no kind words, no welcome. Just cold food and cruel laughter. He turned to his staff and said, "We failed." A few of them looked down, some just kept silent, but no one disagreed. Marco grabbed his coat and said, "I'll be back." Outside, the night air was cool. Marco walked fast through the streets. He didn't know where the couple lived, but something inside him told him he had to try. He walked to the hostess station at the front of the restaurant and asked, "Did you write down their contact number?" She hesitated. "Yes, I think it's in the reservation log." He rushed back, found the number, and dialed it. It rang and rang, until finally, a soft voice answered. "Hello?" It was Mr. Jensen. Marco introduced himself. "Sir, it's Marco, the chef from earlier. Please, I know you're home now, but I need to say something." There was a pause. Then Mr. Jensen said, "Go ahead, I'm sorry." Marco began, his voice shaking. "We didn't treat you right, and no apology can undo that. But I had to say it." There was silence on the line for a moment. Then Mr. Jensen replied, "Thank you for calling. but we really just wanted one nice evening. I know, sir, Marco said. I failed you, and I'll carry that. But I hope one day I can make it right. The next day, Marco returned to the restaurant early. He called a staff meeting and stood in front of everyone. He didn't yell. He didn't blame. He simply said, "Last night, we lost something important, our humanity." Then he told them the full story. From the forgotten table to the walkout, some staff looked ashamed, some just nodded. But something had shifted. People were listening. Marco went to the manager and demanded new training for all staff. "Kindness is not optional," he said. "It's the main dish we serve." He removed the hostess from the front desk and replaced her with someone who actually cared about customers. He added a new policy. Every special note on a reservation must be read and followed without question. Later that evening, Marco sat in his office and thought about Mrs. Jensen's words. "We just wanted to feel welcome." Simple words, but so powerful. They weren't asking for a free meal or attention. They just wanted respect. He looked out at the dining room and imagined the couple sitting there again. Maybe one day they would come back. And if they did, he promised himself, it would be different. They wouldn't sit in a corner. They'd get the best table with the garden view. There would be flowers, candles, and warmth, but tonight their chairs were empty. And Chef Marco couldn't stop thinking about how a beautiful moment was stolen by carelessness and cruelty. He picked up a pen and wrote a letter to the couple. A real letter, not a text or email in it. He shared how sorry he was and what changes he was making at the restaurant. He didn't expect anything in return. He just hoped they'd read it and know they mattered. As he sealed the envelope, he whispered to himself, "No more forgotten tables." And with that, he placed the letter in an envelope marked, "To Mr. and Mrs. Jensen, with deepest respect." Then he mailed it, hoping it would reach their hearts the way their kindness had reached his. Even if his apology had come too late, he still wanted them to know someone had seen them, someone had cared, and someone would never forget them, ever again. The next morning, the sun rose gently over the quiet neighborhood where Mr. and Mrs. Jensen lived. Their home was small but full of memories, each wall holding pieces of a long life lived with love and struggle. Mr. Jensen sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, reading the newspaper. Mrs. Jensen stood by the window, watering her little flower pots. They didn't talk much that morning. The night before still sat heavy in their hearts. They had saved for months just to afford that meal. They had chosen the restaurant because they heard it was the best in town. But instead of kindness, they had been met with silence, cold food, and cruel laughter. Mrs. Jensen finally said softly, "I don't think I'll ever forget the way they laughed at us." Mr. Jensen nodded and replied, "It wasn't right." Then he folded the newspaper and walked over to place his hand gently on her shoulder. "We still have each other," he said. She smiled sadly and whispered, "That's always been enough." Just then, the phone rang. Mr. Jensen answered and listened quietly for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you for calling," and hung up. Mrs. Jensen looked at him, curious. "It was the chef," he said. "He apologized again, said he wants to make things right." Mrs. Jensen didn't reply, but her face softened a little. "It's kind of him," she said after a pause. "But kindness too late still leaves a bruise." That same morning, Chef Marco sat alone in the restaurant's back office, holding a photo in his hand. It was a black and white image printed from the internet. The photo showed a younger version of Mr. Jensen, standing in front of a burning building, holding a child in his arms. He was a retired firefighter years ago. He had saved 5 children from a school fire just a few blocks away from the restaurant. Marco had looked up the Jensens online after finding their last name in the reservation log. The more he read, the more shocked he became. Mrs. Jensen had been a schoolteacher for 40 years. She had taught hundreds of students in the local area, and many still remembered her. They had lived quiet, honest lives, always helping others. They had been part of the town's soul. But no one at the restaurant had cared to know. Marco leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. He felt ashamed not just as a chef, but as a person. These weren't just customers. They were good people. People who had given everything to their community, and they had been treated like they didn't belong. He walked out of his office and called for a team meeting. The staff gathered slowly. Unsure of what was coming, Marco stood before them, holding the photo of Mr. Jensen. "This is the man who sat at table 12 last night," he said, his voice steady. "He ran into a burning building to save children in this town." He looked around the room. "And his wife? She taught at the local school for 40 years. Probably taught someone in this very kitchen." The staff looked down, guilt spreading across their faces. Marco continued, "And what did we give them? Cold food, silence, and a corner seat near the restroom." No one said a word. Even the ones who had laughed the night before were now pale with shame. One of the waiters whispered, "I didn't know." Marco nodded. "That's the problem, we didn't want to know." He placed the photo on the counter. "We are not just serving food here," he said. "We're serving people, stories, memories, feelings." From that day, things would change. He announced that every customer's name would be checked, not just for allergies or payments, but for who they were. A new rule was made. Any reservation marked with a special event would be treated like royalty, no matter how they looked or dressed. Later that evening, Marco wrote another letter to the Jensens, this time including the old photo he had printed. In the letter he wrote, "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Jensen, we failed you not because we didn't serve good food, but because we didn't serve you respect. You reminded me that the most important part of this restaurant isn't the menu. It's the people who walk through the door. Please accept this photo as a small thank you for everything you've given to this town. I can't erase the hurt, but I promise your story will never be ignored again." He sealed the envelope and sent it by hand through a delivery boy with instructions to knock gently and wait. That evening, Mr. Jensen opened the door and found the letter and photo in his hand. He stood still for a moment, surprised by the picture. He called out to his wife, "Come see this." She looked over his shoulder, gasped, and touched the photo with trembling fingers. "That was the day you saved those children," she said, her eyes wet. They sat down together, reading the letter word by word, slowly. There were no big promises, no excuses, just honesty. Mrs. Jensen wiped her eyes and whispered, "Maybe he really means it." Mr. Jensen smiled and said, "It seems he does." They didn't know yet if they would ever return to that restaurant. But in their hearts, something had changed. The pain was still there, but now, Esso was something else. A small spark of healing. A sign that maybe, just maybe, the world could still surprise them in good ways too, even if the kindness came late. It had finally come with truth, respect, and heart. The next day, a photo started spreading across the internet. It was a blurry picture taken at the restaurant. In the corner of the image sat Mr. and Mrs. Jensen holding hands, looking quiet and sad. The person who posted it wrote, "I saw this couple last night, celebrating their 50th anniversary, while others laughed at them and the staff ignored them. This broke my heart." The post was shared again and again. People began writing angry comments. "How can anyone treat the elderly like this? They look so sweet. This makes me want to cry. What kind of restaurant allows this behavior?" Strangers were touched by the simple image of the couple, sitting alone in a corner with cold food and forced smiles. Some people tried to find out who the couple was. Others wanted to know the name of the restaurant. Within hours, the post reached a local news page. The story exploded. It wasn't just about a bad dinner anymore. It was about how the world often forgets to treat older people with respect. People shared their own stories in the comments. "My grandparents were once pushed aside at a coffee shop. My parents went out for their anniversary, and no one even said happy anniversary." It became clear that many people had experienced or witnessed something similar. Soon, someone found out the name of the restaurant. People rushed to leave negative reviews online. One review read, "I wasn't there, but after reading what happened, I never want to eat at a place that forgets its heart." Another said, "Shame on the staff, shame on the manager." And praise to the chef who at least tried to make things right. Meanwhile, inside the restaurant, everything had changed. The staff was nervous. The phones were ringing nonstop. Some calls were from angry people demanding answers. Others were from journalists wanting to speak to someone about the story. Chef Marco sat in his office, reading the comments with a heavy heart. He had thought his private apology to the couple would be the end of it, but now the whole town and even people far away were watching. He knew there was no hiding now. He took a deep breath and decided to speak. He posted a message on the restaurant's social media pages. It read, "We failed two beautiful people, Mr. and Mrs. Jensen, on their special night. There are no excuses. What happened at our restaurant was wrong. I, as the head chef, take full responsibility and deeply apologize. We are making changes, not just for them, but for everyone who walks through our doors. Kindness will be our first ingredient from now on." The post received thousands of likes and comments. Some people appreciated the honesty, others were still angry. But one message stood out. It was from someone who said, "I'm Mr. Jensen's nephew. Thank you for your apology. My uncle and aunt are hurt, but they're not angry. They just wanted to be seen." Later that day, the restaurant remained open, but many tables were empty. Some people canceled their bookings, and others showed up only to ask questions about what happened. The manager looked worried, but Chef Marco stayed calm. He knew this was not about saving the business anymore. It was about saving its soul. Marco called all the staff together again. He told them, "I don't care if you're the best waiter or the fastest cook. If you can't treat people with respect, you don't belong here." One waitress who had laughed with the young group quietly quit that day. Others apologized and promised to do better. Marco said, "We all made mistakes, but from this moment forward, we walk a different path." Outside, the story kept spreading. News stations picked it up, calling it the dinner that broke the internet. TV shows discussed the meaning of respect and how society forgets the elderly. People from other countries shared the story, saying, "This could happen anywhere." But even with all the attention, one thing mattered more to Marco. He still hadn't heard back directly from the Jensens since the letter and the photo. He didn't expect a reply. He just hoped they had felt the truth behind his words. He returned to the kitchen and began cooking something simple, a meal from his grandmother's recipe. As he stirred the sauce and checked the flavors, he remembered her telling him as a child, "People don't always remember the food, but they always remember how you made them feel," he whispered to himself. She was right. Then he walked out into the quiet dining room and placed a white flower on table 12. The table where the Jensens had sat. He lit a small candle and left a note beside it. "For those who came in love and left in silence, may this table always honor your grace." And even though the world now knew their story, what mattered most was that the couple's quiet pain had not been ignored. Their truth had shaken hearts, opened eyes, and forced change. Sometimes, the smallest voices echo the loudest, and the simplest photo can open a door no apology alone ever could. The Jensens had come hoping for a peaceful evening, but without speaking a single angry word, they had reminded the world how powerful dignity and love can be, even when the world forgets to look. It had been 2 days since the dinner. Mr. and Mrs. Jensen sat on their front porch, sipping tea. The weather was calm, and the sky was soft with clouds, but inside, they were still quiet, still thinking about that night at the restaurant. They had not told their family. They didn't want anyone to feel sorry for them. They just wanted to forget it and move on. Suddenly, they heard a knock at the door. Mr. Jensen stood up slowly and walked over. When he opened it, he saw a man standing there with a bouquet of fresh white flowers and a paper bag in his hands. It was Chef Marco. His eyes looked tired, but his expression was soft and full of care. "Good afternoon," Marco said gently. Mr. Jensen blinked in surprise. "Chef, what are you doing here?" "I'm sorry for showing up like this," Marco said, "but I needed to speak to you in person." He held out the flowers and the bag. "These are for you," he said. And this is a meal I made myself, your original order. Cooked properly, Mrs. Jensen joined her husband at the door, also surprised to see the chef. She looked at the flowers, and then at the paper bag. You didn't have to do this, she said quietly. I know, Marco replied. But I wanted to. They invited him inside. The living room was small and full of warmth. Old photos covered the walls, wedding pictures, birthdays, and moments. From long ago, Marco sat on the edge of the couch, holding his hands together, nervous. I came to apologize again, he began. Not as a chef, but as a human being. He looked at them both and continued. You didn't deserve what happened. To you, not for any reason, no one should feel invisible. Especially not on their anniversary. He paused, then added, after you left, I found your name and read about your lives, Mr. Jensen. You saved lives in this town, Mrs. Jensen. You taught children for decades. You gave so much to others. And we gave you nothing back. There was silence for a moment. Mrs. Jensen's eyes filled with tears. She looked at her husband, who gave her a small nod. Then she turned to Marco and said, Thank you for saying that. Most people would never come back after what happened. You could have stayed quiet, but you didn't. Marco lowered his head. I just wanted to make things right, even if it's late, he said. He handed over a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten note and a gift card for the restaurant. It wasn't for money, it was for something called the Golden Table. It read, Dear Mr. and Mrs. Jensen, you are always welcome at our best table, any day, any time, no charge. This seat belongs to you. Mrs. Jensen touched the card with her fingers. She looked at Marco and asked, Why go through all this trouble? He smiled softly. Because you reminded me of something I forgot, why I started cooking in the first place. My grandmother used to say, food is love. But that night, we didn't give you love, we gave you disrespect. They all sat in silence again. But this time, it wasn't heavy, it was peaceful, like the air after a storm. Mr. Jensen opened the paper bag and pulled out the 2 meals. The smell was warm and rich. The steak was cooked perfectly, and the risotto was creamy and fresh. He smiled for the first time in days. This smells a lot better than what we got that night, he joked. They all laughed softly, including Marco. Please let me cook for you again, Marco said. But not at the restaurant. Let me come here. Or anywhere you like. You don't need a fancy chair or candlelight. You just deserve to be treated with kindness. Mrs. Jensen looked at her husband again. He nodded slowly. Maybe next week, she said. We're not ready yet, but maybe one day soon. Marco stood up to leave, before walking out the door. He turned back and said, You changed more than one evening. You changed the entire restaurant. The staff is different now. We have a kindness rule. And no one can sit at a special table without being treated with honor. Mr. Jensen smiled. That means a lot, and Mrs. Jensen added, Maybe we didn't get the anniversary we planned, but this is a memory too. One we'll keep. Marco nodded, stepped outside, and closed the door gently behind him. As he walked away, he felt lighter. He knew he couldn't undo the past. But he had done something better. He had shown that people can grow, that hearts can change. Back inside the house, Mr. and Mrs. Jensen sat at their table. The food was still warm. The flowers sat in a small glass vase, and between bites of their meal, they held hands again. Not because the moment was perfect, but because it was real. It was a new kind of anniversary, one filled with truth, respect, and second chances. And though they didn't know when they'd visit the restaurant again, they knew this. They were finally seen, and for them, that was enough. 1 month later, the restaurant looked very different from before. The walls had been repainted, the lights were warmer, and the music was softer. The hostess at the front now greeted every guest with a real smile. Staff no longer judged people by their clothes or age. And at the center of the dining room, near the garden view, there was a new table. It had golden edges and fresh flowers placed on it every morning. A small sign stood beside it. Written in beautiful handwriting, it said, The golden table, reserved for those who taught us kindness. Everyone who came to the restaurant saw that table. Some asked about it, and when they heard the story, they often grew quiet and nodded with respect. Chef Marco still worked in the kitchen, but he had changed too. He smiled more, listened more, and reminded his team every day, "We don't just serve food, we serve feelings," and every week, he left a white flower on that special table, even if no one sat there. One day, around sunset, a familiar couple entered the restaurant. Mr. and Mrs. Jensen walked through the front door. This time, the new hostess smiled brightly and said, "Welcome, we've been expecting you." Every staff member stood a little taller. The waiters nodded with quiet respect, and at the golden table, everything was perfect: fresh candles, soft music, and their favorite meals ready in the kitchen. Chef Marco came out from the back, wiping his hands nervously on his apron. When he saw them, he smiled. "They came," he whispered to himself. He walked over and said, "Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. Jensen. Your table is ready." They followed him to the golden table. This time, no one laughed at their clothes. No one whispered or mocked. Instead, other guests turned and smiled politely. Some even clapped softly. The couple looked at each other, surprised. They had never been treated like this before. They sat down and looked out the wide glass window at the garden. The sunset painted the sky in soft gold and pink. Mrs. Jensen said, "This is the table we dreamed of." Mr. Jensen nodded, and it was worth the wait. The meal was served hot and fresh, just the way they liked. Their drinks were refilled with care, and every staff member passed by with kindness in their eyes. No one rushed them, no one ignored them. They were the heart of the room that evening. As they ate, Chef Marco stepped aside and watched them from a distance. He didn't want to interrupt their peace. He just wanted to see them happy, truly happy. It was more than a meal, it was a moment of healing. After dinner, the couple was offered dessert on the house. This time, it was made with their favorite flavors, chocolate and vanilla. On the plate, written in delicate syrup, were the words, "Happy 50th plus 1 month anniversary." Mrs. Jensen gasped and held her hand to her chest. Mr. Jensen smiled and laughed softly. "How did they know?" he whispered. She wiped a tear from her eye and said, "Because they finally listened." Before they left, Chef Marco came to their table again. He held out a small wooden box and placed it in front of them. "I want you to have this," he said. Inside was a tiny golden spoon. Engraved on it were the words, "Forever welcome, Mr." Jensen was quiet for a moment, then said, "You didn't have to do all this." Marco replied, "I didn't do it because I had to. I did it because you reminded me of what matters." Mrs. Jensen looked around the restaurant and whispered, "It feels full of love now." Marco nodded. "That's because of you." As they stood to leave, every staff member gave them a soft round of applause. Not loud, not forced, just honest. The couple waved gently and walked out the door hand in hand. Their steps were slow, but their hearts were full. Outside, the air was warm and peaceful. Mr. Jensen said, "I never thought a bad night could turn into something so beautiful." Mrs. Jensen smiled. Sometimes the worst memories make the best stories, especially when they lead to change. And she was right, because after that night, many elderly guests came to the restaurant and felt welcomed. People of all kinds, old, young, rich, or poor, were treated with equal care. The story of the couple who had once been ignored was now part of the restaurant's soul. People didn't just come for the food anymore. They came for the feeling, the warmth, and the kindness. And every time someone asked about the golden table, the staff would smile and say, "That table belongs to the couple who reminded us that love deserves respect." And so, in a quiet corner of the restaurant, a love story continued, not just between a husband and wife, but between two hearts and a world that had learned to listen again. Not through shouting or anger, but through simple grace, quiet dignity, and the power of never giving up on kindness. The apology had come late, but it had come with truth, with change, and in the end, It had become something even more powerful, a lesson for everyone who walked through that door, to never forget the people who walk quietly, because sometimes they leave the loudest mark.